Hello, this is the Truth Seeker, and I'm picking up on a video series that I hadn't been able to get to, but I'm going to get back to it, and that is the Who Wrote the Bible series. We're going to start off with part 8. Let's start the video here, and I'll just respond to it.
To find answers, you need to go back to the very beginning.
Okay, we'll stop right there. He says, to find answers, you need to go back to the very beginning. Now, what is Robert Beckford stating when he says this? Well, if we reference the end of the previous video, he says that he needs to answer the question of accuracy of the Gospels and whether or not the Gospels were written by eyewitnesses. Now, he believes that he needs to go back to the beginning in order to understand this. But we don't really know what he means by back to the beginning. And it's hard to say, but it becomes a little bit more apparent as you watch the video series. What I believe he thinks by getting back to the beginning is that he is examining the first gospel, or what he believes to be the first gospel. And so at first you begin to think that he's going to reference some writings on the walls of some Christian catacombs, because he drags this scholar down under a church in Rome, and but when they get there, they proceed to discuss the persecution of the first Christians and a theory that Mark was the first gospel. Now, I know this may come to a shock to most of you, but the idea that Mark was the first gospel is still very much a theory. And So basically, we have a lot of scholars who have assumed for a very long time that Mark was the first gospel, and they begin to just sort of take advantage of this fact. And but the fact is that it is not a fact. So anyway, so let's move on to the next section of this video.
This church in Rome lies an ancient catacomb. Here, the earliest persecuted Christians buried their dead in secret. It had started 34 years after Christ's death, when the Emperor Nero was looking for scapegoats for the Great Fire of Rome. He pointed the finger at the Christians, and at his word the killing began. Many believe that it's from this persecuted community that the very first gospel writer emerged, sometime around 70 AD. Mark.
Okay, we'll stop right there. So he gets into the Markan Priority theory, and if you'll note the wording of Robert Beckford, many believe. In other words, you have to believe that Mark was the first gospel written. So it is not a proven fact that Mark was the first written gospel. And this is a fatal flaw which most liberal scholars make, and conservative scholars. Basically having so much faith in the priority of Mark that people begin to speculate all sorts of other beliefs about gospel text, gospel formation, but basically the priority of Mark has become the chief cornerstone on which New Testament scholarship thought, actually I should say critical scholarship, has built its house upon. So, what do I think of that? Well, I would say it's unfortunate for the liberal scholars because the priority of Mark theory has become a shaky ground and is resting on sinking sands. So,
we don't know precisely who Mark is. He doesn't sort of sign his book at the end and say, "This is where I've come from, this is who I am."
okay. So this is Mark Goodacre, whom Robert Beckford is interviewing. And he states, we don't know precisely who Mark is. He doesn't sign his book at the end and say, this is where I come from, this is who I am. So Mark Goodacre, who I guess at the time was currently associate professor at the Duke University, I'm not sure if he still is, but he makes a statement about how little we know about Mark. And it's almost as if this criterion taints the gospel account. So maybe that's why he says this. Maybe not. I don't know. But regardless, the fact is that basically we have countless historical documents. Okay, not just the Gospels. We have countless historical documents in which we have very little knowledge regarding their authors. So, some people might say that I am making an assumption about this statement in regard to the authorship of Mark. But, you know, as we proceed in this video series, there will be little doubt on the point that Robert Beckford's stance is to question the authorship of the gospel based on first-hand account veracity. Now, on a side note regarding Mark Goodacre himself, he stands opposed to the Q gospel theory. Not sure if any of you are familiar with the Q gospel theory. But he stands opposed to that, and he actually wrote a book on the subject. Now, he still makes a case for Markan priority, but he does so in a way that he doesn't need to pander to the Q gospel propaganda group, is like what I like to call them. But my point being is that, you know, there are many viewpoints on gospel priority. And, you know, no one definitely has shown without a shadow of a doubt that the Gospel of Mark was indeed the first gospel written. But, you know, not according to, you know, the critics, not according to Robert Beckford. You know, according to them and according to him, it seems like, you know, all these things we can know for certain, and you know, the liberal critics somehow have this secret formula that allows them to crack the gospel code. But you know, in reality, it's a Markan priority religion that is not akin to what I would call, you know, good scholarship. So let's move on.
But you can pick up clues from the Gospel about who he is. It's quite possible that Mark, like many of the other Christians in this period, actually has personally experienced persecution. He's very realistic and gritty. You know, you can smell the dirt and the blood in Mark's Gospel. In some ways it's because of the persecution that Mark wants to write the first Gospel, because you've got to try and make sense of it. And what better way of making sense of it than telling the story of the first real martyr of this new faith, Jesus himself.
Mark may have known persecution, but what did he know firsthand about Jesus himself?
All right, let's stop right there. So there are a lot of assumptions in the area of textual criticism. For instance, Mark Goodacre assumes that he knows the period in which the Mark Gospel was written. And this is hence his statement, like many other Christians, quote unquote, in this period. So, which period is he referencing? What date is he referencing in the first century? Well, why, it's somewhere around 70 AD, of course. And why is this? This is because everyone seems to have pinpointed the Gospel of Mark to around or after this date due to a reference of the destruction of the temple in the Gospel of Mark. Now, this, of course, does not allow for the possibility that Jesus actually prophesied the destruction. Now, stay with me here. Others have made the point that it would not have really even been a great miracle for someone to predict such an event. This is given the political circumstances of the times. In other words, it's very easy to look out at our present geopolitical landscape and make a prediction about a certain event occurring. And this would be tantamount to Jesus stating that the temple was going to be destroyed. And so it's very probable that the writer of Mark put pen to paper long before the destruction of the temple. I'm saying it's probable. One does not even need to defend a supernatural belief in someone's ability to prophesy. Okay? Now, I only present this argument for those who would insist that to believe in prophecy is outdated and stupid. In other words, we cannot believe that Jesus prophesied the temple destruction, so therefore it must have been written after the event actually occurred. But as I have stated, Jesus makes a statement which many of the political pundits of our day would consider common sense more than supernaturally inspired. And so, back to my point. Mark Goodacre makes a statement about the Christians, quote unquote, during this period. But that is assuming that we all agree on the period in which he is referencing to. But we don't all agree on the date of the Gospel of Mark. So, we don't all agree with the conclusion which would spring forth from speculation on the period of Christian persecution. And this is my point, that it is speculation in regard to the date of Mark and speculation as to why the gospel was written. And so it is very disconcerting to listen to the scholarly community freely admit to speculation upon speculation and let others accept conclusions as somehow being scientifically arrived at. Now, I really don't lay the blame on Mark Goodacre in this interview, because I don't know all of his stances on the varying degrees of form criticism, but I do find it shameful how Robert Beckford continues to pass off speculation as fact, which is not challenged by opposing scholars, because it is challenged. And Markan priority continues to be a speculation which is debated. Now, Beckford makes the statement as if, we have arrived at a sure foundation. He presents his case as if he has a pillar from which to build his case. He states, quote unquote, Mark may have known persecution, but what did he know firsthand about Jesus himself? So basically, first and foremost, Beckford assumes that Mark Goodacre has proven that Mark was written during a period in which Christians were persecuted, which was after the destruction of the temple. Mark Goodacre, as well as other scholars, only speculate based on their belief about the period in which the Gospel of Mark was written. Second, Robert Beckford again brings up the eyewitnesses argument. In other words, unless the Gospel was written by someone who witnessed it firsthand, then it is nothing more than a case of Chinese whispers. So it should also be said at this point that the Gospel of Mark does not claim within its pages to be a first-hand account. The tradition that the Gospel was penned by Mark was passed down from the first century Christians unto their second century disciples. And that tradition states that it was John Mark, who was a companion of St. Peter, who wrote the Gospel of Mark. So, we'll move on from there.
The thing is, when you're looking at the Gospels, we don't know it's true. There are no independent archaeological records where you can check things up. No one was out there with a camcorder, recording these things. There wasn't even anyone taking notes, as far as we know. So a lot of it we're being asked to take on trust. I don't think Mark himself is an eyewitness. For a start, he never actually says, I did this, I did the other. So he's not even claiming to be an eyewitness. But what I think you do find in Mark's Gospel is some quite interesting reminiscences from some of the earliest people that were involved with Jesus himself. People like Peter, James and John, they've talked to people. And these oral traditions have found their way to Mark.
All right, let's stop right there. So, the more I review this series of who wrote the Bible, the more obvious it becomes that the people whom Robert Beckford has interviewed have, in most cases, been quoted out of context. Take Mark Goodacre, for instance. Beckford takes him down into an ancient catacomb, a process which, with camera crews and lighting, must have been a 3 or a 4 hour period of time. And the quotes we are given have very little to do with the context they are given. Aside from the obvious reference to Christian persecution, we are told very little about the catacombs that they are standing in, but more about the philosophical arguments such as, we don't know if it's really true, and we have to take the accounts on trust. Well, tell me something I don't know. And then the point is brought up again about Mark not being an actual eyewitness. Actually, this is speculation by the scholars. Note that even Mark Goodacre states, I don't think that Mark was an eyewitness. In other words, he cannot prove that the gospel writer Mark was an eyewitness, but he thinks that he probably was not. In his books, he goes into much greater depth into why he believes Mark to be the first gospel, but we are not really given those arguments in this interview. but essentially they are good ideas which still do not entirely prove Markan priority. Now, a point should be made in regard to how the author of Luke's Gospel identifies the fact that he investigated the matters himself before writing his Gospel. While on the other hand, Matthew and Mark make no such references. This seems to indicate the opposite of what most scholars conclude. In other words, this seems to lend to the argument that the Gospel of Mark was written by an eyewitness, because, after all, Mark makes no mention of having investigated the matter himself, but Goodacre seems to make the opposite conclusion, citing the lack of first-person narrative in the Gospel of Mark. Now, with this same line of reasoning, we could conclude that any written document which is not written in the first person must have been written by a third person and not an eyewitness. Now, this, of course, would be a horrendous assumption on our part. But again, to the point of Mark being an eyewitness, it seems minuscule and ridiculous. It seems that Robert Beckford is clinging to an idea that unless the Gospel was written by someone who was on the scene, then it simply is not to be trusted. Well, this seems to be the implication. It seems to be read between the lines. However, according to tradition, it could be entirely possible that Mark was one of the original 72 disciples chosen by Jesus to spread the gospel. So while Mark may not have been the one of the first 12 apostles, he would not have been far removed from the events. Now, add to this little snippet of information the tradition which states that Mark was the companion of Peter, who was indeed very closely associated with the events accounted for in the Gospels. Mark was said to be the interpreter of Peter. Some would take this to mean that Mark translated for Peter more eloquently in the Greek language. Then, of course, there is the theory that we don't know who wrote the Gospel of Mark, even though tradition seems quite clear that this is the Gospel according to Mark. So let's move on to the next section.
That the first Gospel writer was relying on hearsay is a bit of a thunderbolt. Then you realise that lots of Jesus' story isn't even there in the earliest Mark manuscripts. No nativity, no long sermons, no resurrection appearances. In the end, it's less a record of events than a self-help guide that says suffering and persecution are the best way to God.
Okay, that's quite a statement. So, Beckford makes the statement that the first gospel, and I must stop here and remind everyone that we actually still cannot state with certainty that Mark was the first gospel. Let us not forget that some people hold to Lucan priority or a Matthean priority. And each view comes with its own views on how these three Gospels came to be formed. Now, this is an important point because Beckford is making a statement that sounds like a fact. But it is not. It is not a proven fact that Gospel that the Gospel of Mark was the first gospel written. Now, I see this often with liberal critics. They have great faith in Markan Priority. Such faith they have that they proclaim Mark was the first gospel as a fact. It is like a religious devotion to Markan Priority. Markan Priority has become a quote-unquote gospel unto itself. Now, Robert Beckford then proceeds to state that the Gospel of Mark was based on hearsay. Well, now, that's interesting because that is not what I had heard previously from his interview with Mark Goodacre. Perhaps there's some film footage of the previous interview of which we missed where Mark Goodacre stated that the gospel was based on hearsay. Perhaps not. But it seems to be a spin on Mark Goodacre's words. And keep in mind that we cannot state with certainty that the Gospel of Mark was indeed not an eyewitness. Now, this is because there possibly remains that the Gospel of Mark was indeed written by a disciple of Jesus. Remember, tradition states that Mark was a companion of Peter and one of the 72 disciples which Jesus sent out. But Robert Beckford has some sort of secret knowledge. He is a Gnostic for Markan Priority. He is a true believer in Markan Priority because that is what faith is. Faith is believing in something that cannot be seen, and that is what it is. So, a point is brought up about most of the Jesus story not being present in the Gospel of Mark. The transition is from hearsay to a lack of historical accounts in Jesus' life. In other words, first one comes to realize that Mark is hearsay. And then from that realization follows an understanding that the Gospel of Mark is lacking many of the accounts of the other Gospels. Now, I do not see the connection between the two. In fact, I do not know how to explain the logic of this conclusion. If anything, I do not see that this information is helping Robert Beckford's case or his cause. Instead, it seems to offer a plausible reason for believing that the Gospel of Mark was indeed not the first gospel written. For example, if everyone already knew about the Nativity by reading the other accounts, then perhaps Mark, when he wrote his gospel later on, felt that he would not focus on the other aspects. He would instead focus on other aspects of Jesus' life. Robert Beckford, he then ends his section by summing up the Mark narrative as nothing more than a self-help guide for those in suffering. Now, I should remember this the next time I go to the bookstore, because I keep going over to the religious section to pick up my Bibles, but now I realize I should be browsing the self-help section instead. I've got nothing against self-help books, but I find this conclusion very petty and very trite. And the quote-unquote evidence which is assumed to arrive at this speculation conclusion is the following. Number one, it is assumed that Mark was written first. Number two, it is assumed that Mark was written in 70 A.D. or around 70 A.D. Number three, it is assumed that Mark must have known persecution. And number four, Mark does not mention all of the same accounts as the other Gospels. Therefore, it should not really be considered a history, but should be categorized as a self-help for the persecuted. The assumption being that the account is a product of the early church community written to deal with the reality of persecution. Now, according to Robert Beckford, because the Gospel of Mark does not contain all of the events of the other Gospel accounts, then it must mean something. And what does that mean? Well, it means, of course, that Mark is really less about a record of events and more of a self-help guide. That makes perfect sense, right? But only if you are a liberal critical scholar. So, we'll end that section there.
Mark is the creative genius that gets this whole process of writing Gospels going. In a way, it's quite an arrogant, quite a conceited thing to do, to say, I'm going to do an authoritative version of this story. It has a kind of propaganda purpose, I think.
Okay, again, I need to correct the statement by pointing out that we do not know who wrote the first Gospel. It is, at this point, being assumed by the speaker that the Gospel of Mark was written first. And, as I have stated, this is a theory. It is a theory of Markan priority. But the speaker, Mark Goodacre, moves beyond this theory and is speaking about Markan priority as if we all accept this theory. He states, Mark is the creative genius who gets this whole process of writing the Gospels going. And, well, we cannot be sure of this, because what if Matthew was the first to write his Gospel? Then Mark wouldn't be the creative genius. And it is another thing to also use the term, quote-unquote, creative genius. Because it is the traditional view that the Gospels are testimonies of the life of Jesus and not simply a work of a creative genius. The speaker then moves on to make a point to state about how arrogant and conceited the writer of Mark is. This is interesting because you seem to get the unspoken message behind this statement, which I'm not quite sure how to interpret. Again, I need to bring up the point that Robert Beckford seems to have edited out large portions of this person's interview, because this scholar, Mark Goodacre, is obviously, he was obviously talking for quite some time, but only the only part that Beckford's interested in is in his speculation that the Gospel writer may have been arrogant and conceited. And this, of course, is based on the Markan Priority view. But we could also say the same thing about any other ancient writer. We could call Pliny the Elder arrogant and conceited for writing his work, Natural Histories. Or we could call Tacitus the same for writing his history. It seems like this is what is being stated, but as the comment is taken out of context in the interview, I'm just not going to speculate anymore on what he meant by that. But if you're interested in reading more about Markan Priority, Matthean Priority, or Lucan Priority, I will put some links in this video description. All you really need to know regarding this matter is that we do not know for certain which gospel was written first. Now, regarding the Gospel of Mark propaganda, it is uncertain to me how this fits into the narrative. Again, I must point out that this interview is highly edited, and Mark Goodacre is making many points on and off the camera that we will never know. We are thereby missing these comments in context, so I have no way of understanding how he comes to the conclusion that this is like propaganda. But if I go by what has been given, it would sound like he's stating that because Mark is the first gospel, he as a writer was arrogant and conceited, and therefore his gospel is like propaganda. This, of course, makes no sense whatsoever. So, to add to my point, it's all based on accepting that Mark was the first gospel, and we really do not know that to be true. So, we can believe that it's true. We can state that we speculate it is true. And therefore it is true, then maybe this is true or that is true. But we really cannot assume that we know for certain which gospel was written first. Another note about the use of the word propaganda. In most cases, this word has a negative connotation. But in some cases, it is what it is, which is simply getting a message out to the public in an emotional context. And propaganda is a word which can mean one thing to one person and another to someone else. To put this simply, one man's propaganda is another man's gospel. So, which meaning is Mark Goodacre assuming we understand? Is he hoping that we see this as a negative point against the Gospel of Mark? Or is he just using this word for lack of a better word? Well, I have gone to Mark Goodacre's website and I've studied a little bit, and I'm more inclined to believe that his comments are to be taken from a more positive perspective. And this is odd to me because the way in which Robert Beckford presents this interview with Mark Goodacre, we get the most negative message regarding the gospel and walk away with a sense of that the Christian gospel of Mark wasn't a very Christian person at all.
Okay, so the writer of Mark seems in this light to lack some of the most basic Christian values, which made him an arrogant, conceited man who was out to spread hearsay by using propaganda. Now, this is certainly not what Mark Goodacre stated, but this seems to be the message that Robert Beckford would like to convey to the public. So, let's take a look at the next section.
Mark's big idea took off. A decade or more later, over in Antioch in Syria, another man turned his hand to writing Jesus' story. But this time, it's a PR campaign for a very different kind of Christ.
Well, most people...
Okay. So Robert Beckford states, Mark's big idea took off. A decade or more later, over in Antioch in Syria, another man turned his hand to writing the Jesus story. But this time, it's a PR campaign for a very different kind of Christ. So, the first thing I have to say is, Mark's big idea. Well, I'm not certain what to think of this comment. I'm sure it does not refer to the arrogant and conceited writer of the gospel and his stories, which are all based on hearsay. So, what is this big idea? Well, I can only assume that this is to be the quote-unquote authoritative version of Jesus' history, which he, Mark, is credited as being the first person to have the big idea of writing an authoritative account of Jesus' history. That seems odd. In other words, no one ever in the histories prior to the life of Jesus ever had an idea of writing an account of another person. Well, we are led to believe that no one thought it necessary to write down anything about Jesus, or that no one thought it was necessary to write down all of everything that everyone remembered about Jesus. This must have been the big idea. Well, the problem with this speculation, of course, is tied up with the Markan Priority assumption. Yes, it is an assumption that Mark wrote first, and that therefore it is another assumption that this quote-unquote big idea was Mark's, and that it was him who got the ball rolling with this quote-unquote big idea. So now that Robert Beckford seems quite pleased with himself, that he has established that Mark was the first gospel, and that it is nothing but hearsay, and furthermore was written by an arrogant, conceited Christian, he turns his attention to what he believes to be the second gospel, which was written. But, as we will see, even in this, we cannot be certain. So let's take a look at the next section here.
You might think first off that Matthew's Gospel is written by Matthew the tax collector, one of the 12 disciples. When you look at the document carefully, you see that the Gospel doesn't look like the product of an eyewitness. So who is this character? Well, the most important thing of all about Matthew is this is clearly a Jewish writer that knows all about the habits and the ways and the laws of Judaism.
All right, let's stop right there in regard to Judaism. So in turning our attention now to the Gospel of Matthew, we are confronted with the statement that the Gospel was not written by Matthew the tax collector. A more accurate statement would have been, while we cannot verify that the Gospel of Matthew was written by Matthew the tax collector, we certainly cannot rule out the possibility that it was written by him. But instead, we are presented with part of the truth which does not go far enough. There is a constant setting aside of the entirety of the story. And what is the whole of this matter? Simply this, which is that the gospel comes out of the 2nd century AD as being attributed to Matthew, and we cannot verify that it truly was written by the tax collector, but we cannot also state the opposite. So it would be inaccurate for us to discredit the authorship of Matthew to Matthew the tax collector. So a reference is made to the gospel not appearing as though it is a product of an eyewitness. This may be referring to the passage in Matthew chapter 9, verse 9, which speaks of Matthew in the third person. In other words, if Matthew was the author, wouldn't he speak in the first person when referring to himself? Well, this is a possibility. But we still cannot rule out the possibility that Matthew considered himself less than the story he was proclaiming, and did not want to detract the readers away from the central focus, which was Jesus. On a side note, only the Gospel of Matthew identifies him as Matthew the tax collector. One could also speculate that this is because Matthew, the tax collector, wrote the Gospel of Matthew and identified himself as such. And so the possibility that the Gospel was written by Matthew the tax collector remains a viable alternative, which also happens to line up with the tradition of the Christian church. So let's move on to the next section here.
Rather than go back to the drawing board, Matthew started by copying large chunks of Mark's Gospel, then rewriting or adding his own bits.
In the ancient world, there's no copyright laws, and you can just copy stuff out, and Matthew does. I mean, sometimes word for word.
Okay, let's stop there, because we're getting into the whole copying theories. And so, again, I must point out that the Markan priority is assumed as established as fact. Now, I cannot deny that a large portion of scholars believe that Mark was the first gospel. But I also cannot, after looking at the evidence myself, conclude that this is an established fact. The reason is because there always exists the ability to speculate in strong ways to believe the opposite to be the truth. For example, if Matthew was first to pen his gospel, then it is entirely possible that Mark makes use of the material in Matthew. And at this point, I must stop and address the matter of gospel writers using each other's material. For it is one thing to be an eyewitness, and it is quite another situation to be removed from the events which took place and to use material from an eyewitness to claim as your own material. In the first case, we could assume that if Matthew wrote his gospel first, and if Mark wrote his gospel second, that Mark was commenting on certain aspects of Matthew's account, which Matthew did not deem necessary to mention in his account. This is assuming that Mark wrote second, because there is the possibility that Luke wrote second, then Mark. So, we can easily speculate that rather than Matthew adding bits and pieces to Mark's account, that Mark excludes data from Matthew's account in most places. This would be due to the audience which Mark was writing for not needing specific information suited for Matthew's Jewish audience. And so the speculation can go both ways. If it is possible, then we cannot assume to know what Matthew did or what Mark did. All we can state is that there are many various possibilities that might have occurred to bring about the first three Gospels in similar form and structure to each other. And so, we cannot know if Matthew copied word for word from Mark, or if it was the other way around. What if Mark copied word for word from Matthew? Now, a bit about the discussion regarding the copying of word for word from gospel to gospel. There is an assumption that the writers are copying Greek words into Greek words. Well, in most cases, I can state that most scholars assume a Greek to Greek copying of words, but the possibility of translating Aramaic to Greek, Hebrew to Greek, or Latin to Greek is minimized. Okay? This is an important point. What is the result of assuming that Matthew copied the Greek gospel of Mark? Well, the problem is very simply stated. If we assume that the similarities in Greek are due to copying from Greek to Greek, then we must not ignore the differences which also occur in the Greek Gospels. How do we explain the following differences? In the case of words where a synonym is used, parts of the Gospel which do not coincide with each other. In the both cases, those who assume a Markan priority simply state that the differences in Matthew and Mark are due to Matthew simply, quote-unquote, rejigging the story to suit his purpose. Well, it is a convenient explanation, but it ignores another possibility for instances where synonyms of words are used in the Greek. Could it only be because Matthew wished to state it another way? In other words, is there another way in which we could explain the Greek synonyms? In the two which contain synonymous agreement, basically in comparing the Gospels of Matthew and Mark, we can see that there are 767 locations between the two which contain Greek synonyms. Okay? Now, in Matthew, 884 Greek words are synonymous with 904 Greek words in Mark.
So in some phrases are synonymous with more than one word to state the same general meaning. Percentage-wise, this amounts to about 4.8% of the Gospel of Matthew and about 8% of the Gospel of Mark. So what does this mean? So the question is, if indeed Matthew, quote-unquote, copied from Mark, why would he change the Greek words to other synonymous Greek words? Another question could also be considered a possibility, which is this. Can we explain these synonyms by any other reason other than Matthew or Mark just felt like using other words? The answer is yes. There is another possibility which explains the synonymous agreement of the Gospels, and it is this. It is possible that the product of synonymous agreement is due to translation from one language, from another language, into Greek. That's right. Most of the scholars who assume Markan priority seem to not address this possibility. That is, that it is entirely possible that the reason for the synonymous agreement is due to a possible translation from either Aramaic to Greek or Latin to Greek. Consider this scenario. There is a possibility that Matthew was originally written in Aramaic or Hebrew. At some point down the line, it was translated to Greek. Mark was said to be the companion of Peter and his translator. Peter may have had an Aramaic or Hebrew copy of Matthew in his possession. It is possible that Mark records the words of Peter, who preaches with a copy of Matthew in front of him, and also gives his version of the gospel events. In this scenario, we can explain the synonymous agreements in another possible way, other than Matthew simply copying the Greek and reworking the Greek words to his preference. If Matthew was originally in, say, Aramaic and later translated to Greek, then the synonyms appear due to independent translations from another language. Basically, that one translator, not knowing what the other translator is doing in different regions, comes up with a synonymous word in the Greek language. So the problem is very simple. By only focusing on the word-for-word exact agreements in Greek, one gets caught up in how to explain the interdependence of the Gospels. But if one will shift their attention to the differences of the Gospels and try to understand why they are different from each other, then one will begin to see other possibilities as to how they relate to one another. So that's my gist on the whole copying scenario. So let's move on to the next section of the video.
Isn't this just plagiarism?
Okay, let's stop right there. He says, isn't this just plagiarism? Now, if we consider if the reason that the Gospels are similar to each other is due to plagiarism, we need to clarify what is being implied. That is, first, it is implied that Mark was the first Gospel. Okay? And that it is far removed from the eyewitnesses is another speculation. It is also implied that Matthew came after Mark.
which means that Matthew is far removed, and based on a supposed hearsay of Mark. It is implied that Matthew simply used the framework of Mark and rewrote it for his purposes by copying and pasting into what he needed. Now, if we are going to state that one writer copied from another writer, then we need to examine the word-for-word exactness from gospel to gospel in order to see if the evidence would tell us anything in regard to the results. Now, incidentally, the word-for-word exact agreements in Matthew and Mark amount to about 25% of Matthew and about 40% of Mark. Looking at this from another viewpoint, we can state that the points of absolute differences between Matthew and Mark amount to about 65% of Matthew and about 43% of Mark. In other words, 43% of Mark is not in Matthew. Okay? And 65% of Matthew is not in Mark. Okay? Now, if we state this another way, there are 40 locations which contain word-for-word exactness. Okay? In the Greek, between Matthew and Mark. Of the 40 places which agree exactly, here is what we can summarize in regard to the phrases. Number 1, the longest phrase from the 40 places is 29 words long. The rest are as follows. In 2 places, they are 23 words long. In 2 places, they are 20 words long. In 1 place, they are 19 words long. 1 place, 18 words long. 1 place, 17 words long. 3 places, 16 words long. 1 place, 15 words long. 4 places are 14 words long. 3 places are 13 words long. 7 places are 12 words long. 5 places are 11 words long. 9 places, 10 words long. And 7 of the 40 places are Old Testament citations, which can said to be static and excluded from consideration of the possibility of copying. All but 1 of the 40 places are sentence fragments. They either start as an incomplete sentence or end as a fragment or both. Now, from the above items of exact resemblance, we can count a total of 4,573 words. This, as stated previously, is about 25% of Matthew and about 40% of Mark. Now, what does all this mean? Does this information tell us anything in regard to which author supposedly copied from one gospel to the other? In other words, can we see from the data who copied from who? Now think about this for a while. The best that we could possibly state would be still speculation, which is that if one gospel is missing information, then the author could have written it first. Okay? However, we could also speculate that this author wrote second And when he wrote, he simply excluded the information from the previous author. Okay? Now, beyond just the allegation that the Gospels amount to plagiarism, we need to open our minds to other possibilities which explain the items of close resemblance in the Gospels. For instance, one can assume to think that the Gospels are supposed to be thought of as independent witnesses to the accounts of the life of Jesus, or one can think that each account of the Gospels are interrelated to each other by their stated relation between the apostles and disciples of Jesus. In other words, it can be speculated that each Gospel writer built his testimony on the previous. In some places, they add to their own remembrances, and in other places, they exclude information which they consider already conveyed by the previous testimony. But if, on the other hand, a scholar wishes to speculate that the Gospels are independent accounts, separated from each other by longer spans of time, then one can speculate that writers simply copied from the first account and filled in the places which do not occur in the earliest speculated account. In this case, one could be tempted to call this process plagiarism. The other thing which must be stated in regard to plagiarism is that it is a certain kind of copying which is associated with taking another person's writing and attributing it as their own work. It's basically not a very Christian thing to do. So, there is another type of copying that needs to be defined outside of plagiarism. Consider the following speculations. What if Mark was closely associated with Matthew? What if Matthew was written first? What if the Apostle Peter actually preached from the Gospel of Matthew and took it with him on his journeys? And what if Matthew, who was said to be the translator of Peter, wrote down everything which Peter preached? In this scenario, we see a different kind of copying. We see a possibility of Matthew allowing Peter to take his gospel with him to use. In our day and age, this is called copywriter's permission. Okay. In this possible explanation, we see another answer to the items of exact resemblance between Matthew and Mark. Besides just plagiarism, and that is the possibility of a separate translation of a possible Aramaic or Hebrew Gospel of Matthew. In this case, we can account for the items of exact resemblance, as well as those Greek words which are synonyms. In other words, someone translated an Aramaic or Hebrew Matthew into Greek and used Greek synonyms in some places, and in other places happened to use the same Greek words that Mark used in translating Peter's preaching from an Aramaic or Hebrew Matthew. So, let's move on to the next section of the video.
The thing is, you have to say that if Matthew was writing today, he could take him to court for plagiarism. There's no question about it. What Matthew, I think, is trying to do is supplant Mark. He's trying to take it over. Matthew thinks that Mark's picture of Jesus isn't quite right. He knows that Jesus was a Jew, and he knows that Jesus was more Jewish than Mark is inclined to paint him. So if you like, he goes through the process of almost re-Judaizing Jesus and making him more Jewish.
Okay, so now we're getting into the re-Judaizing of Jesus. Now, Mark Goodacre answers Robert Beckford by stating that we basically don't know for certain that Matthew plagiarized from Mark. But this is really a conclusion which can be arrived at if one believes that the authors of both Gospels are far removed from each other by years, and that they are not who they state the Gospels are attributed to. In other words, Mark isn't really a disciple who Jesus commissioned, and Matthew isn't really a tax collector who was an apostle. Both Gospels are the work of unknown authors who are using the identities of Matthew and Mark to make their own work seem more important. Oddly enough, it would seem that currently the only earliest information we have on Matthew and Mark is from the Gospels themselves. So it is hard to understand how the authors of Matthew and Mark, would somehow see these figures as people that they would wish to impersonate. Anyway, but going back to the point of Matthew being a plagiarist, we can only state that he copied from Mark if we know for certain that Mark did not give him permission to use his gospel framework, or vice versa, if Matthew allowed Mark to use his work. Because we cannot be certain that perhaps Matthew wrote his first, then allowed others to freely use it in their teachings, and the point being that plagiarism is only plagiarism when one writer uses the material of another writer without their permission. So, can we state for a certainty that we know that Matthew, Mark, or Luke did not give permission to others to use their writings in their preaching? No, we cannot state that for certain. So Mark Goodacre makes a statement in regard to Matthew wanting to supplant Mark. In other words, Matthew wants to replace Mark's gospel. Matthew would be perfectly happy if Mark's gospel account faded away and was never known again. That is basically the message I get from this conclusion. In other words, the only reason that Matthew wrote his gospel was to set things straight and correct the mistakes of Mark. But what about the other possibilities? And that's this. Perhaps Matthew wrote first. Perhaps Matthew gave permission to Peter and Mark to use his gospel in their teaching. Perhaps Mark uses Matthew's framework as an outline for Peter's account, and those same stories in Matthew. So instead of viewing the Gospels as having this adversarial relationship to one another and trying to supplant one another, we have a different scenario where the apostles and disciples are working together on a common message. And this is a very plausible possibility for the shared resemblances of the Gospels, besides just chalking it all up to different communities of faith and a war of ideas with each other. So that brings up another point about the nature of a gospel itself, which is that the whole point of the gospel message is to share the good news. In fact, the words of Jesus in Matthew chapter 28, verse 20, were about teaching everyone to obey everything he had commanded the apostles. They were commissioned to teach all disciples the gospel. And so it seems quite likely that they would welcome as much distribution of the gospel message as possible. So let's move on to the next section here.
So Matthew adds the Christmas story, the Sermon on the Mount, and the Lord's Prayer, all pointing to Jesus as the fulfillment of the Old Testament prophecies. And this is probably why his book ends up with top billing in the New Testament.
All right, let's stop right there. So Robert Beckford begins to move forward with the assumption that Mark was the first to write his gospel, then Matthew copied from Mark. But as stated previously, this is not an assured fact. This is what we can be sure of. The only thing that we can be certain of is that it is highly likely that the Gospels are interrelated to each other. But we cannot be sure of which one was written first. Again, as I have stated, if one believes that Mark was first, then it is possible to speculate that Matthew copied from Mark. But even then, we cannot be sure if perhaps Mark allowed Matthew to copy by giving him permission to do so. Also, we cannot presume to think that Matthew adds the Christmas story, or the Sermon on the Mount and the Lord's Prayer as fabricated stories, but simply as his own recollections, which Mark did not include in his account. Again, if one presumes to think that Matthew was not actually written by Matthew the tax collector, and was written after Gospel of Mark was written, which means sometime after 70 A.D., then one begins to speculate that the Gospel of Matthew was written by someone who had a possible third degree of separation of the accounts from the actual eyewitnesses. And by speculating all of this, one would conclude that Matthew added his stories, which are not in Mark, and what if it was the other way around? I mean, what if Matthew wrote first? Then Mark, who was the companion of Peter, records Peter's teachings while he reads through Matthew's gospel. It is a possible explanation. Mark is the gospel which most recollects Peter's experiences with Jesus. Mark seems to give the gospel account through the eyes of Peter. In other words, Peter uses Matthew's framework, but gives his remembrances to Mark, who writes them down in either Latin or Greek. In this case, Matthew is not adding stories to his gospel, but Mark is leaving out that which perhaps Peter felt did not need to be addressed again. In other words, Peter is addressing the same stories in Matthew when he feels that he can add more from his own remembrance of the history which occurred. Now, in regard to the point that Robert Beckford is trying to make, that Jesus is portrayed as fulfilling the Old Testament prophecies in Matthew's Gospel, he seems to imply that this is not the case in Mark, or even in Luke. Well, this is a sloppy point, in my opinion, because the very claim that Jesus is the Christ is in all four Gospels, as well as many references to the Scriptures being fulfilled. Perhaps Robert Beckford is trying to state that Matthew emphasizes this point more, but for any serious student of the Gospels, one cannot escape the clear Jewish tones of all four Gospels. Okay? So, while Matthew seems to state things from a more scriptural Jewish outlook, whatever this means, let us not forget that the Jews themselves had many views in the first century. And we can certainly, we just cannot consider Mark a lesser Jewish perspective. So we'll move on.
So is Matthew the first salesman of a Jewish Jesus?
I think so. I think one of the things he wants to do is he wants to make Jesus a son of Abraham, a son of David, paint him like Moses.
Most people...
Okay, so let's stop right there. And going over those comments again, Robert Beckford states, so Matthew is the first Jewish, he says, first salesman of a Jewish Jesus. And Mark Goodacre states, I think so. I think one of the things he wants to do is he wants to make Jesus a son of Abraham, a son of David, paint him like Moses. So what we get from this is, one is inclined to believe that Matthew copied from Mark without Mark's permission and added his own stories to make Jesus more Jewish. Then one could perhaps draw the conclusion that Matthew is a salesman of certain ideas. The words which Robert Beckford used in describing the gospel writers continue to offend me. So let's just recap his conclusions so far. Number one, Mark is an arrogant, conceited propagandist of a story based on hearsay. Number two, Matthew is a salesman of a plagiarized story based on hearsay with his own made-up parts added to prop up his message. Well, okay, you may think that I'm exaggerating when I state these things, but this is really what Robert Beckford is saying. And now, Mark Goodacre makes a statement in regard to Matthew, painting Jesus as a son of Abraham, a son of David, and like Moses. This is kind of basically implying that the other Gospels do not paint this picture. Or perhaps he means to state that Matthew seems to paint this picture with more details. For we certainly cannot deny that Mark also paints Jesus as a son of David. Consider Mark chapter 10, verse 47, in which blind Bartimaeus calls out to Jesus, Jesus, son of David, have mercy on me. How much more Jewish can this be? Also, consider these following passages in the Gospel of Mark. Mark chapter 1, verse 12, speaking of Jesus' 40 days in the wilderness, which is an obvious allusion to Moses' 40 years in the wilderness. Mark chapter 4, verses 35 through 41, shows that Jesus commands the waters just as Moses did. Mark chapter 6, verse 30 through 34, and chapter 8, verse 1 through 11. Jesus miraculously feeds the multitudes. This is similar to Moses giving the Israelites instructions regarding manna in the desert. Mark chapter 6, verses 45 through 56. Jesus walks on the water. Moses parts the waters and walks through them, but Jesus walks on top of the waters. Mark chapter 8, verse 29, Jesus asks Peter, "Who do you say that I am?" Peter answered, "You are the Messiah." Mark chapter 9, verse 2 through verse 12. Jesus is transfigured. This is an obvious allusion to when Moses came down off Mount Zion and his face glowed with glory. Mark chapter 11, verse 1 through 11. Jesus comes into Jerusalem as King of Israel. The crowds declare, "Blessed is the coming kingdom of our father David." So, now you judge for yourself whether or not the Gospel of Mark does not paint enough of a Jewish picture of Jesus. For the writer of Mark most certainly does not ignore the central message of the Gospel, which is the coming of a Jewish Messiah to the Jewish nation of Israel. Basically, Mark Goodacre is speculating that the Gospel of Mark just does not paint enough of a Jewish picture of Jesus. So this is the reason that Matthew writes another account. But are we left with any other reason why Matthew may have written his gospel? Perhaps Matthew is following the command of Jesus in Matthew chapter 28, verse 20, which is to teach everyone of all of what he commanded. Perhaps the writer of Mark is also following the command of Jesus to relate the gospel. Perhaps both Matthew and Mark relate their separate accounts and agree in some places, and in other places relate information from their own point of view. So let's move on to the next section.
People read this gospel as history, but you're suggesting it's propaganda. How do you hold that together as a Christian?
I think the thing is, it's not a case of either or. It's not a case of just because something's got a bit of spin, just because something's trying to tell a particular story to a particular group of people, that it's not got any history in it.
Okay, let's stop right there. So Robert Beckford says most people read this gospel as history, but you're suggesting it's propaganda. How do you hold that together as a Christian? And Mark Goodacre states, and he says this rightly so, because I believe Robert Beckford is sort of trying to put words into Mark Goodacre's mouth. But Mark Goodacre very clearly states, I think the thing is, it's not a case of either or. It's not a case of just because something's got a bit of a spin, just because something is trying to tell a particular story to a particular group of people, that it's not got any history in it. So what this tells me is that Mark Goodacre is not using the term propaganda in the sense of what we would think of as like World War II propaganda. So I believe we've come to a point where Mark Goodacre is clearly disagreeing with Robert Beckford here. Instead of directly objecting to Robert Beckford's continued use of the word propaganda, Mark Goodacre explains to us what he really means by propaganda. In other words, don't think of propaganda in the senses you normally would, which is perhaps associated with untrue notions, but instead think of propaganda as telling a particular story to a particular group of people. So Mark Goodacre is clearly making an appeal to everyone, not to think of a bad propaganda, but simply just a campaign that gets a message out to a targeted audience. And so Robert Beckford also seems to agree. Mark Goodacre also seems to disagree with Robert Beckford's radical implications that the Gospel of Matthew is more fiction rather than history. So it is worthy to note that in his interview, Mark Goodacre never even stated that Matthew was a type of propaganda. It was earlier in the discussion that Goodacre stated in so many words that he thought that the Gospel of Mark was a kind of propaganda. But Robert Beckford is jumping to the conclusion that Mark Goodacre must mean this is about all of the Gospels. As I stated earlier, it may be that there is quite a bit of footage in this interview that never made it to the cutting room floor because it is very obvious that Robert Beckford has a message that he is stitching together, and he is less interested in the holistic answers that he is getting in his interviews. So let's move on to the next section here.
By this point in the late 1st century AD, the tone's been set for the Gospels, and it was all about being a consummate spin doctor. Like Luke, an educated man based in Greece, Luke focuses on taking the Bible into the mainstream of the Roman Empire, writing not just the Gospel, but the book of Acts too, describing the spread of Christianity from Jerusalem to Rome.
Okay, let's stop there. So now we begin the section regarding the book of Luke and the book of Acts. Robert Beckford has assumed at this point that he has established that Mark wrote first, then Matthew copied from Mark, and now he declares that Luke wrote third. But as I continue to point out, these are all disputed topics. We do not know if perhaps Matthew wrote first, then Luke wrote second, and Mark wrote third. Or maybe Matthew, then Mark, then Luke. But based on Robert Beckford's faith in Markan priority and his belief that Mark was written sometime after 70 AD, and his belief that Matthew wrote second, he comes to the conclusion that Luke must have written sometime in the late 1st century AD. So rather than go into the various arguments on the dating of Luke and the book of Acts, as well as the other Gospels, I will simply state that if one is interested, there are countless websites and other resources for this topic. I will recommend one particular web article on the topic of dating the Gospels by James Patrick Holding, entitled Trusting the New Testament. You can find that link at www.tektonnics.org. Well, I'll put the link in the description. Needless to say, there are plenty of strong arguments for believing that Luke wrote his gospel prior to 70 AD. But Robert Beckford really isn't interested in giving us the whole picture in this area of scholarship. And so he has filtered those arguments out for you by simply telling you which conclusions he believes to be true. Next, Robert Beckford moves on to discuss the quote-unquote tone of the day during the writing of the Gospels, which somehow he has tapped into. Beckford seems to know that it is all about being a consummate spin doctor. And not just a spin doctor, but a consummate spin doctor. In other words, not just someone who is mediocre at their trade, but someone who is the most highly skilled at spinning a web of fabrications to be used in a campaign built on propaganda. Incidentally, for those of you who missed Robert Beckford's play on words, he makes a reference to a spin doctor. And traditionally, Luke was said to be a doctor. Essentially, at this point, Robert Beckford isn't even using the comments from Mark Goodacre anymore, aside from mere mentions of particular words. For instance, Mark Goodacre makes one point about Mark being a type of propaganda, and Robert Beckford concluded that Matthew is nothing more than propaganda. Likewise, Mark Goodacre states that just because Matthew has a bit of a spin in it, that it doesn't mean that there is nothing historical in it. But Robert Beckford takes the one word spin and uses it as his foundation for understanding the tone of the day, which he states is being a consummate spin doctor. What about the other possible solutions? Perhaps Luke didn't write his gospel third. Maybe he wrote his gospel second. And perhaps he wrote his gospel according to his research which he conducted. Traditionally, Luke would still have had access to the disciples and apostles which Jesus taught to on a day-to-day basis. We could also speculate that Luke also used either the Gospel of Matthew or Mark as a framework for his gospel as well. But when he excludes material from the others, it is because the others have already adequately addressed the stories in their gospels. So let's move on to the next section of the video.
Luke wants to tell the whole world this Christian religion is reputable, it's okay. He's trying to say, look, it might sound nutty, this stuff. It's about some Jewish carpenter in some backwater. And he's saying, no, Christianity is respectable. It is the kind of thing that a civilized, middle-class kind of Roman citizen like me can believe in.
All right, we'll stop right there. Oh, wait. A little bit more here.
It's something which is right there at the heart of the empire. And Luke really paves the way for Christianity becoming a Roman imperial religion.
Okay. So, Mark Goodacre states that Luke wants to tell the whole world this Christian religion is reputable. It's okay. He's trying to say, look, it might sound nutty. This stuff's it's all about some Jewish carpenter in the backwater. Then you say, no, Christianity, it's respectable. It's the kind of thing a civilized, middle-class kind of Roman citizen like me can believe in. It's something that is right there at the heart of the empire. And Luke really paves the way for Christianity becoming a Roman imperial religion. Well, I have to agree somewhat with what Mark Goodacre states in his points here, except, of course, in his paraphrase of Luke's underlying message about the gospel sounding nutty. I have read Luke's gospel a number of times, and never did I get the impression of an underlying message of a kind of apology for the gospel itself. In other words, Luke never states in so many words that the gospel is nutty or crazy or any kind of ridiculousness. But I do agree with his sentiment that perhaps Luke did wish that others would see Jesus as the universal Savior that he understood him to be. So, moving on.
The spin of the last Gospel's the most obvious. It was written by a Jew called John, who's kicked out of the synagogue in Paul's old city, Ephesus, at the end of the 1st century. And by writing extra, slightly unreal speeches for Jesus, John's peddling a specific new angle.
Okay, we'll stop right there. Robert Beckford states, the spin of the last Gospel are the most obvious. It was written by a Jew called John, who was kicked out of the synagogue in Paul's old city, Ephesus, at the end of the 1st century. And by writing extra slightly unreal speeches for Jesus, John is peddling a specific new angle. So moving on to the Gospel of John, Robert Beckford seems quite confident at this point to dismiss it as the most obvious of fabrications. As he puts it, it is the Gospel with the most obvious traits of spin. Of course, he doesn't go into detail about what those obvious things are. He simply references John's stories as quote-unquote slightly unreal speeches, and so you have to take his word for it. Of course, this is just more the greater debate in regard to the Gospels. If you're interested in the wider scope of the debate on both sides, then I encourage you to seek out those truths for yourself. But be assured that whether the Gospel of John is just spin, or rather the actual recollections of the Apostle John, is a matter open for debate, and it is not a settled matter. Now, a word about Robert Beckford's portrait of the Apostle John. According to Beckford, John is a peddler of a message, not a preacher, but a peddler. So the notion seems to evoke a picture of one who's trying to sell trite little products to eke out a meager living. I also want to address the topic of the Apostle John being kicked out of the synagogue. It seems to me an interesting interjection by Robert Beckford because it may be historically accurate, but Beckford tends to use words in a way which conveys a negative meaning. John was, quote-unquote, kicked out of is a type of unsavory notion. On top of this, he was a peddler who was kicked out of. It's a type, basically, first of all, we can certainly assume that John, as well as many other apostles and disciples, were excommunicated from the larger Jewish community for obvious reasons. But we really don't have the actual account in John's Gospel or any other source which can verify that John the Apostle was excommunicated. Aside from John chapter 16 verse 2, where Jesus is quoted as stating, let me turn the page here, "They will put you out of the synagogue. Indeed, the hour is coming when whoever kills you will think he is offering service to God." So Jesus is making a statement in regard to all believers, of which John is included. But you get the idea from Robert Beckford that he's referring to an actual account from history which we can pin down and reference, especially in regard to John. This, of course, is not the case, and is simply another example of the way in which Robert Beckford perceives and interprets history. So, in summary, a quick overview of Robert Beckford's portraits of the gospel writers are as follows. Mark was an arrogant, conceited propagandist of a story based on hearsay. The Gospel of Matthew was a salesman, and he was selling a plagiarized story based on hearsay with his own made-up parts added to prop up his own message. Luke was a consummate spin doctor. John, a peddler of made-up stories. And so, we are not really given any other possibilities as to who the gospel writers were and why they wrote their accounts. We are only given Robert Beckford's decision as to his own conclusions, or perhaps his ideas which he was taught in order to become an academic theologian that he is. Because, as I have stated in previous videos, Robert Beckford isn't presenting anything new. For the last 100 years, higher biblical criticism has taught this. And yet, Robert Beckford continues to give us the message that this is all new to him. Yet if he went to school to become an academic theologian, then there's no way he could have missed all this and graduated. He is pretending, or rather reenacting his past by discovering these quote-unquote revelations so as to pull the viewer into his mindset. So let's move on here.
Why the need for a fourth gospel?
Because John wrote the gospel, we've got to assume that he must have been dissatisfied with the others in some way. I suspect that the thing that he didn't like about them was that they didn't quite get their vision of Jesus right. The Jesus in the other gospels is not quite, if you like, divine enough.
So is it...
All right, let's stop right there. Robert Beckford asks Mark Goodacre, why the need for a fourth gospel? Mark Goodacre answers, because John wrote the gospel, we've got to assume that he must have been dissatisfied with the others in some way. I suspect the thing that he didn't like about them was that they didn't quite get their vision of Jesus right. The Jesus in the other gospels is not quite, if you like, divine enough. So, I would like to point out how subjective the approach of Mark Goodacre was in answering this question. He states, quote, we've got to assume, end quote. In other words, this is an assumption on his part. There seems to be no other logical conclusion as to why John wrote his gospel other than he was dissatisfied with the other accounts. Next, we move on from his assumption to what he suspects, which is that John didn't think that the others painted a divine enough picture of Jesus. Well, this argument seems to circle around the fact that John does indeed paint a clear picture of Jesus as a divine Messiah. But judge for yourselves if this was the reason why John wrote the gospel. The following passages from Matthew, Mark, Luke, and Acts, which also clearly paint a picture of Jesus as a divine Messiah. So Matthew, chapter 1, verse 18. Mary is found to be pregnant by the Holy Spirit, signifying a divine birth. Matthew, chapter 3, verse 17. Jesus is baptized by John, and a voice from heaven proclaims, "This is my Son, whom I love. With him I am well pleased." Matthew chapter 7, verse 21. Jesus says, "Not everyone who says to me, 'Lord, Lord,' will enter the kingdom of heaven, but only the one who does the will of my Father who is in heaven." This passage is a clear picture of a divine Messiah who stands in the kingdom of heaven. Matthew chapter 10, verse 32. Jesus teaches, "Whoever acknowledges me before others, I will also acknowledge before my Father in heaven." Jesus is here clearly acknowledging his special relationship with Father God. Matthew chapter 11, verse 27. Jesus states, "All things have been committed to me by my Father. No one knows the Son except the Father, and no one knows the Father except the Son, and those to whom the Son chooses to reveal him." That seems obviously divine. Matthew chapter 12, verse 8. Jesus reveals himself as Lord of the Sabbath by stating, "For the Son of Man is Lord of the Sabbath." Matthew chapter 13, verse 41. Jesus teaches that the Son of Man is head over the heavenly kingdom, stating, "The Son of Man will send out his angels, and they will weed out of his kingdom everything that causes sin and all who do evil." Matthew chapter 14, verse 33. Then those who were in the boat worshipped him, saying, "Truly, you are the Son of God." The apostles worshiped Jesus, thereby indicating their belief in his divinity. Matthew chapter 16, verse 16. Simon Peter answered, "You are the Messiah, the Son of the living God." In this statement, Peter proclaims his faith that Jesus is a divine Messiah. Matthew chapter 16, verse 27. "For the Son of Man is going to come in his Father's glory with his angels, and then he will reward each person according to what they have done." Matthew chapter 17, verses 1 through 5. Jesus is transfigured, and a voice states, "This is my Son, whom I love. With him I am well pleased. Listen to him." Matthew chapter 19, verse 28. Jesus said to them, "Truly, I tell you, at the renewal of all things, when the Son of Man sits on his glorious throne," we'll just end that there. That's obviously divine. Matthew chapter 24, verse 30. "Then will appear the sign of the Son of Man in heaven, and then will all the peoples of the earth mourn when they see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven with power and great glory." Matthew 25, verse 31. "When the Son of Man comes in his glory, and all the angels with him, he will sit on his glorious throne." Matthew 26, verse 64. "You have said so," Jesus replied, "but I say to all of you, from now on you will see the Son of Man sitting at the right hand of the Mighty One and coming on the clouds of heaven." Matthew chapter 28, verse 19. "Therefore, go and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Spirit." Here we have a most powerful allusion to the divinity of Jesus. In the book of Mark, chapter 1, verse 1, the beginning of the good news about Jesus the Messiah, the Son of God. Here we see in the first verse of Mark the concepts of the Messiah and the divine Son of God being fused together. Mark chapter 1, verse 11. and a voice came from heaven, "You are my Son whom I love. With you I am well pleased." Mark chapter 2, verse 7. Why does this fellow talk like that? He's blaspheming. Who can forgive sins but God alone? Mark chapter 2, verse 28. So the Son of Man is Lord even of the Sabbath. Mark chapter 5, verse 7. He shouted at the top of his voice, "What do you want with me, Jesus, Son of the Most High God? In God's name, don't torture me." Mark chapter 9, verse 7. Then a cloud appeared and covered them, and a voice came from the cloud, "This is my Son, whom I love. Listen to him." Mark chapter 13, verse 26. At that time, people will see the Son of Man coming in the clouds with great power and glory. Mark chapter 14, verse 62. "I am," said Jesus, "and you will see the Son of Man sitting at the right hand of the Mighty One and coming on the clouds of heaven." Luke chapter 1, verse 35. The angel answered, "The Holy Spirit will come on you, and the power of the Most High will overshadow you. So the Holy One to be born will be called the Son of God." Luke chapter 3, verse 22. "And the Holy Spirit descended on him in bodily form like a dove, and a voice came from heaven, 'You are my Son, whom I love. With you I am well pleased.'" Luke chapter 4, verse 41. "Moreover, demons came out of many people, shouting, 'You are the Son of God.' But he rebuked them and would not allow them to speak, because they knew he was the Messiah." Luke chapter 5, verse 21. The Pharisees and the teachers of the law, thinking to themselves, "Who is this fellow who speaks blasphemy? Who can forgive sins but God alone?" Luke chapter 6, verse 5. Then Jesus said to them, "The Son of Man is Lord of the Sabbath." Luke 7, verse 49. The other guests began to say among themselves, "Who is this who even forgives sins?" Luke chapter 8, verse 28. When he saw Jesus, he cried out and fell at his feet, shouting at the top of his voice, "What do you want with me, Jesus, Son of the Most High God? I beg you, don't torture me." Luke chapter 9, verse 20. "But what about you?" he asked. "Who do you say I am?" Peter answered, "God's Messiah." Luke chapter 9, verse 35. A voice came from the cloud saying, "This is my Son whom I have chosen. Listen to him." Luke 17, verse 24. "For the Son of Man in his day will be like the lightning, which flashes and lights up the sky from one end to the other." Luke chapter 21, verse 27. "At that time they will see the Son of Man coming in a cloud with power and great glory." Luke chapter 22, verse 69. "But from now on, the Son of Man will be seated at the right hand of the mighty God." Luke 23, verse 42. Then he said, "Jesus, remember me when you come into your kingdom." Luke chapter 24, verse 52. Then they worshipped him and returned to Jerusalem with great joy. Acts chapter 2, verse 33. Exalted to the right hand of God, he has received from the Father the promised Holy Spirit and has poured out what you now see and hear. Acts chapter 3, verse 13. The God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, the God of our fathers, has glorified his servant Jesus. Acts chapter 3, 15. You killed the author of life, but God raised him from the dead. We are witnesses to this. Acts 4:12. Salvation is found in no one else, for there is no other name under heaven given to mankind which we may be saved. Acts 5, chapter 31, or chapter 5, verse 31. God exalted him to his own right hand as Prince and Savior, that he might bring Israel to repentance and forgive their sins. Acts 7, verse 56. Look, he said, I see heaven open, and the Son of Man standing at the right hand of God. Acts chapter 7, verse 59. While they were stoning him, Stephen prayed, Lord Jesus, receive my spirit. Acts chapter 9, verse 20. At once he began to preach in the synagogues that Jesus is the Son of God. Acts chapter 10, verse 36. You know the message God sent to the people of Israel, announcing the good news of peace through Jesus Christ, who is Lord of all. Acts chapter 13, verse 39. Through him, everyone who believes is set free from every sin, a justification you were not able to obtain under the law of Moses. So, after this litany of scriptures, what can we say? What can we say about Matthew? What can we say about Mark? What can we say about Luke? What can we say about the book of Acts? After viewing these gospel passages, we can see the portrait of Jesus as a divine being who was born of the Holy Spirit, called the Son of God by a voice from heaven. He forgives the sins of others, is worshipped by his followers, is called Lord of the Sabbath, is seated at the right hand of God, and is King of the heavenly kingdom, and is prayed to by the martyr Stephen. So Mark Goodacre's statement that the Apostle John perhaps felt that the others didn't portray Jesus as divine enough seems a rather weak argument in light of the previous passages. But instead of stating that the others didn't portray Jesus as divine enough, one could state that John states directly what the others state indirectly. Where John states, the Word was God. The other Gospels state that the Son of Man is Lord of the Sabbath. Where John states that Jesus and the Father are one, the other Gospels show the followers of Jesus worshiping him. Where John records Jesus stating, when you see me, you see the Father. The other Gospels record Jesus forgiving sins, an act which is only an attribute to God. So clearly, the followers of Jesus saw him as springing forth from the divine and worshipped him as divine. Does this picture seem to substantiate the argument that John the Apostle felt the others didn't quite paint Jesus as divine enough? In my opinion, no. But judge for yourself if the other Gospels do not paint this picture of Jesus as God. Acts chapter 3, verse 15, quote, "You killed the author of life, but God raised him from the dead. We are witnesses of this." Clearly, the writer of Acts is painting more than just a little bit of a divine portrait and sending the clear message that Jesus is the author of life. This notion seems right in line with John's statement that through him all things were made. Without him nothing was made that has been made. So, let's move on.
He just rewriting history.
I think that the author of John's Gospel is definitely meditating on these events and thinking about them, kind of working them, rejigging them a little bit for his own time. I mean, is he actually, in some of these things, actually feel like making things up? Well, I think he would see it as being inspired by the Holy Spirit to put into writing some of these things that the other writers of the Gospels haven't actually got to the heart of.
This all seemed totally opposite to what I was brought up to believe as a kid, and what only the other day all those pilgrims I met in Jerusalem were counting on. So the question for me now as a believer is whether it discredits the Gospels if they're not just simple reportage. One of the things I've learned from being in Rome is that you can't read the Gospels literally. They're not meant to be read as eyewitness accounts. We don't know what really happened, but maybe we don't need to, because if we see these texts as an attempt by a community to work out what's happening in its life by reflecting on the life of Jesus, then we can see them as books of faith. They aim to communicate faith. So it seems to me, if you read the Gospels as straightforward historical fact, then it's just as dangerous as reading the Old Testament that way, because you're going to miss the point of what they're really about. So it's back to England to talk to a guy who's transformed himself from underworld villain to born-again Christian, simply by reading and believing the New Testament Gospels.
Seem to get a blinkered attitude that maybe Christians are a weak type of person and they're like a wimp and you're walking along with an old duffel coat and sandals and you won't say boo for a goose. Now, to me, the Bible...
Okay. So let me stop right there. That would be the end of part 8. I believe I answered most of the things previously, but let me just spontaneously kind of go over this here. You know what? I think I've addressed all this already. But if you want me to address some of these things, go ahead and put it in the comments. That will conclude the series of Who Wrote the Bible response to part 8. I will begin to work on part 9. And God bless you all. Keep seeking truth. And I look forward to my next video.